Super quick disclaimer before we get into things. So this video I'm going to be talking about The Last of Us 2 a lot, and I do confuse the names of Ellie and Abby because they're so similar. So a couple of times I mean Ellie, but I say Abby, and the other way around. So just use context clues to figure out who I'm talking about. Hello and welcome back to another episode of wait a second, this isn't an episode of my philosophy book, so if that's what you came here looking for, then turn away now because you will not find anything here for you. Or stick around, I don't know. Maybe you'll like it. So really, there's not going to be so much philosophy in this one particularly, so if that's not what you're interested in, then do feel free to go away and never come back again. Recently, I played The Last of Us 2. It's a very big game, coming off the back of another very big game, The Last of Us. And I had some thoughts on it, so I kind of thought, maybe I'll make a bit of a, I guess you could call this a review, but it's also a kind of a comparison kind of thing. And maybe you're thinking, yeah, but why are you putting it up here on my philosophy book? Well, it's my channel, and I can do what I like. As I said, this is going to be about The Last of Us 2, but I'm going to be comparing and contrasting it to Red Dead Redemption 2. Why? Well, I seen an article scrolling through my phone a couple of weeks ago, kind of when Last of Us 2 came out, and a couple more kind of things online, basically comparing The Last of Us 2 to Red Dead Redemption 2 in terms of sales and stuff. And how they're both kind of big games that were expected to do really well, and Red Dead Redemption 2 did, Last of Us 2 did at the start, but then sales kind of petered out quicker than they thought. They kind of started to dwindle and die off, I think to do with a lot of the bad reviews people were giving it. But it got me thinking, are there other similarities, kind of, if you take a closer look? And I think there is, in terms of kind of stories and themes and stuff, as well as the fact, as I said, that these are two sequels to very big, very popular single player games. So if you haven't played either of them, you've probably played Red Dead, but if you haven't played The Last of Us 2, then I will be spoiling certain aspects, so be warned. So a quick recap of Red Dead as a series. We won't go into Red Dead Revolver for those super fans who know about that, because that doesn't really have anything to do with it. But Red Dead Redemption 1, we play as John Marston, an ex-criminal, part of the Dutch van der Linde gang, who is being forced by the government, by the Pinkertons, to hunt down the old members of his gang in order to get back his son and his wife. And this game, it kind of came out, as I said, it came out after Red Dead Revolver, which, I don't think is a game many people know of. It didn't really have anything to do with this. So it kind of came out of nowhere. Now, obviously, Rockstar has GTA and Bully and LA Noire and stuff, so they weren't unknown, but essentially, they kind of just took a shot in the dark with this idea, and it really stuck. It really resonated with people because of its gameplay. It's very immersive gameplay, and Rockstar does that really well in terms of just kind of getting the feel of a game right. You want to feel like a cowboy, and they get that right. You want to feel like a school bully or a detective, and they get that feeling right. Then we go to Red Dead Redemption 2, where you play as Arthur Morgan, and it's a prequel. We're back with the Dutch van der Linde gang, and we see the events that directly lead into Red Dead Redemption. And we play as Arthur Morgan as he's running with the Dutch van der Linde gang, and we see kind of them at their peak, and then the eventual kind of fall of the gang and how that affects Arthur. Then we have The Last of Us. The Last of Us, again, came from Naughty Dog, which they do Uncharted, Crash Bandicoot, and probably some other things. I'm not super well versed with them. But again, so it's, they're not an unknown. It's not like an indie developer or anything. But it's a new series that kind of came out of nowhere, and it just took everything by storm. So you play primarily as Joel, this guy who, in the midst of this kind of zombie breakout, this infected kind of breakout, loses his daughter. Then, several years later, he finds this girl, Ellie, who is immune to the infection. She is immune to the virus. You can kind of see where this is going. He, kind of puts her in place as the surrogate daughter because he is given the job. I can't remember whether he takes it on or whether he's given the task of she has the possibility to make a vaccine, in her blood. So he's going to take her, from one side of the country to the other to this hospital where they're going to, be able to make a cure. Um, so, you got your clear goal. You got to get from point A to point B, and you can see how, Joel, who has lost a daughter and now has found this surrogate daughter, you can see the kind of character dynamic there. Then we get on to The Last of Us 2, which takes place mainly 4 years after the events of the first game, and we see how Ellie and Joel's relationship has kind of changed, and after Joel's death at the hands of an ex-Firefly, how Ellie goes on a mission of revenge. So that's kind of a brief outline of what we're working with. I'm going to go into more detail in just a little bit, but I'm going to start off comparing and contrasting the gameplay. So in Red Dead Redemption 2, obviously two of the big differences, one of the biggest differences between them is Red Dead is free roam and The Last of Us isn't. It has elements of it, where I guess it's not just like, mission up, mission down, like you have to go and travel to the mission, but it's quite, you're directed on where to go. It's very, like, you don't have a lot of choice, I guess. They show you where to go and you can choose very minimally. I think there are certain points, I kind of noticed that, where there's certain points where it's almost like there's a fork in the road and you can go left or you can go right. But you're still going to end up in the same place and you're going to get there the same way, more or less. Whereas Red Dead 2, it's free roam. There's going to be a point on the map, and whether you come at that from north or south, or how you get there is completely up to you. You can walk, you can get a horse, you can get a carriage. It's completely unplanned. And then, because of this, I think Red Dead 2, gameplay-wise, has some unique story moments. And what I mean by that is the way things happen aren't going to be the same every time. So, you come up to someone and I'm trying to think of an example. So I think it's kind of near the start. You do a raid on one of the rival gangs, as Arthur, and you clear out the gangs. You're going through, and they say the people come up, your gang members come up, and they're like, "Oh, do you want to go left or right, or will we do this stealthily, or will we do this kind of guns a blazing?" And you can choose like that, but more so than that, you get to the end, and then there's like a cabin, and I remember now because the first time I went, I just went, oh, a cabin, went to open the door, and there was a guy waiting with a double barrel shotgun, and I just died. I just died immediately. So then, the next time I played it, I knew that was going to happen. But even if I didn't know that was going to happen, if I decided I just kind of wanted to be, stealthy, and I wanted to check the place out, I would have known that. I could have, peeked through the window. I could have shot him through the window. I could have hid behind a log and shot the door open, and when he ran out, so that encounter could have happened many different ways. And he's always going to be in the cabin, but how you approach it is always going to be different. Whereas in The Last of Us and The Last of Us 2, it's much more scripted. If something has to happen, you're either going to have a kind of cutscene where it happens, and you do have cutscenes in Red Dead, but like for little things like this, you're going to have a cutscene, or if it's like an important character, it's more or less going to happen the same way. Now, obviously, that is you could argue that in The Last of Us 2, when you get into a kind of a combat zone where there's just guys going around, you can stealth around, or you can go guns blazing, and you do have that option. But in terms of kind of, I suppose you have the option, but your options are somewhat limited. Because, I mean, realistically, in Red Dead 2, you could just say, I'm gonna, get on my horse and I'm gonna ride 5 miles east, and then 7 miles west is going to take 3 days, but I'm going to come back at them from the other side. Whereas Last of Us 2, you're on a straight line and you have to get through them. And there is really only, that's the only way you can do it. You can choose how you get through that zone, but you're going to end up, you're going to start at the start of the zone and end at the end. Red Dead 2 has a very detailed game environment. Now, obviously, they sold that a lot, stuff like if you step on the mud, you're going to have prints, but the mud is going to get on you. Like if you fall on the ground, you're going to leave a print that is, the same as, whatever part touched you, and you're going to be dirty there unless you go clean it in a bath or in, clean water. If you get blood on you and all this kind of stuff, and then if the blood gets on you, and this are elements of in the free roam, so obviously I don't want to lean too heavily into that because then that's not a fair comparison. But the playground essentially that you're given to play with is very detailed, and very kind of naturalistic in that way. Contrast that to The Last of Us 2, which has I would say it is quite detailed. There was one bit kind of near the end of the game when you're Ellie and you show up on a beach. And just kind of out of curiosity, I was kind of walking along and I could see that the way the waves were coming in, um, it was different every time. It was kind of quite real. And then you leave the footprints in the sand, but if you put them on the wet sand and the waves come in, they, um, wash them away. So I thought that was a nice little detail that you wouldn't necessarily notice, but it's good. However, one problem that I have with this is things like, so obviously because it's a linear game, they have to put boundaries. They don't want you to go too far away from where you're supposed to go, and usually it's like a building that's all boarded off and bricked up, and that's fine. Or it's like some kind of big obstruction. But then there was like little things where you just kind of come to, I guess, a corner of the map, and it would be like a big wall, and a big car in the way, and then like a bush, just a thick bush, and yeah, like I get it, and it makes sense, and I've played games, so I know I'm not supposed to go there. But when we have games like Red Dead 2, where like the sky is the limit, you can go anywhere you can see, you can go pretty much, and then just to be stopped by a bush when in reality you'd go, well, I'd just walk through the bush, or I'd climb over the bush, or stuff like that, where you're like, I could just climb over that really easily. Like, why am I doing this kind of puzzle segment? And yes, that's the game. Like, and as I said, they did Uncharted, and they did kind of Crash Bandicoot, so they have platformer and kind of platformer challenge, puzzles. That's kind of their thing. So they have elements of that, and that makes sense, and they're fun. Um, but yeah, just little things like that though that kind of annoyed me, with just those stupid, like, oh well, like I just go through the bush, like why, well, like, and they kind of take you out of the game where you're like, oh, it's so serious, oh, it's so it's so real and raw, oh, but you can't crawl over a bush. Another thing about Red Dead Redemption 2 is that there's a noticeable difference, I think, in the gameplay between it and its predecessor. So they keep things pretty familiar. You have, your weapons wheel and that kind of the interface is quite similar, but um, the way it does kind of they're kind of subtle changes, but they are noticeable. The way the weapons fire, and some people weren't crazy about it, and I think even I was a bit like, because I don't know. There's something about the way you fire guns. It's a bit slower, but I think that adds an element of realism, and that kind of adds to the immersion of, it's a video game, but you feel like you are a real life cowboy. You're not just, shooting millions of bullets, at NPCs. You're like, this is a real gun, and every bullet counts, kind of thing. And that is true to, and that is true talking about Last of Us 2, but in Red Dead Redemption 2, um, they kind of added these elements and the way the horses move and the way you move and interact with people, um, and the environment. It's much more realistic. And they made loads and loads of changes, and there was a pretty big gap. So I think people expected a lot of changes, but I think they did it well in where they kept a lot of things familiar. It's the same kind of thing, but they just polished it off a lot and kind of added new features, which were really fun and interesting. Last of Us 2, honestly, I didn't really notice much of a difference in terms of gameplay and kind of interacting with your environment from the first one. But interestingly, I was talking to a friend of mine about it, and he was saying he noticed the same thing, but for him, he thought that was a good thing. Um, he was like, "Oh yeah, no, it's great because it's just like playing the first one, and I love the first one." So, they didn't ruin it. I guess maybe is what he's thinking. Which can happen where they change something up, and it just kind of ruins the feel of it. I would say like Assassin's Creed is an example of that, where I think kind of the first three games or so just have this certain feel to them. Um, that after you get to kind of Assassin's Creed 3, um, Black Flag, they just don't feel the same. So he thought this was a good thing, but I wasn't too mad about it. I think I would have liked to see kind of little things, and I'm sure there are kind of really kind of subtle things, but broad strokes, I didn't really notice anything different. As I said, Red Dead 2 is pretty immersive. It's fun as well, which is just a big point because it is a video game. It's a source of entertainment. So as much as it is a storytelling medium, it has to be fun, and it is fun. You get to feel like a cowboy, and it really does feel like you're in the old west. The way it's set up. Um, Last of Us 2, kind of focusing on them now more so. It is more linear. It's not free roam. So I'm not gonna fault that. That's the type of game it is. So there's much more kind of scripted moments. You know, like you jump out of a window and then there's someone waiting there to get you, or you crawl under a thing and someone rushes out and knocks you over. You probably wouldn't have that as much in Red Dead because you could go anywhere, so it's hard to script those moments. But to counter that, because of these kind of scripted moments and because they know exactly where you're going to be, the game has a more cinematic quality in that sense, where they show you all the moments. You have to look at the moments, and they choose how you look at them. Like when the wolves are attacking the Scars Island, and you're kind of fighting your way through with uh, Abby, Abby and Lev, and like there's this one bit where you come out and you're crawling through, it looks like an old school or something, and then you come out and you look out the window and you see the whole kind of island is on fire and stuff. And it's cool, and they have cool looking kind of shots like that throughout. It makes sense because you had to go that way, and because of that you get to see that, and it's pretty cool. So that's not necessarily a fault, but it is something that's different. Is It's much more scripted, but then plus that it is more cinematic. Another point on that, actually, before we move on, is um, I guess one thing that goes against Red Dead 2, because you have that freedom, you do miss out on some of these moments. An example I have is when I was playing Red Dead 2 the first time around. After the bank robbery in Saint Denis, and you're running away, and it's everything's gone wrong, and Jose has just died. You're running, and Lenny gets killed on the roof. People jump out and jump out from a corner and kill him. I was looking behind me for whatever, I don't know, because I was thinking people are going to come up behind me because I had that freedom of movement. And I heard a gunshot and I looked around and it was just like Lenny's corpse on the ground and two guys. And I was like, what? I missed it. I just missed that whole moment. So I made sure to see it the next time around. But like that, you're given the freedom, but that's the cost. You might miss out if you're not looking. So I've already mentioned that I'm not a huge fan of kind of map boundaries in Last of Us 2, especially and I know I kept talking about the bushes, and I'm gonna sound like some crazy, like bush mad person, but the thing I'm thinking of is when you enter these kind of combat zones, some of them are pretty cool. You come in and you're like, oh, there's infected all around me. But usually the way it works is there's like a way out. There's a particular way out, and I guess you kind of have the choice of whether you want to fight or run, because no matter what, if you kill everyone, when you get to that door at the end, it's always like a slow push door that you have to slowly, like, hold down triangle to open. When you push it out of the way, you quickly close it off and, block the door behind you, which makes sense because if you choose to run, that's adds tension, and it's an incentive not to run because they might catch you. But it's also scary if you see them getting closer and closer, and then you just make it through at the last minute. So that's grand. And sometimes it's like, oh, you're deep inside a building and you push through the only doors that are there, and it makes sense. But there's one near the end where you're fighting the gang of like filthy bikers, and I think it's like you have to follow the train tracks down to a certain way, but then I I don't know. I wasn't sure where the way out was, so I just ended up killing everyone. And then I found it. I was like, oh, grand. And it's a train cart next to a building, and you open it. You open one of the doors, and then you get in, close it, and lock it, and then hop down and start walking, kind of in a little alley next to the building. The problem is, if you can visualize this, is the only thing between the train cart and the building is a bush. So if I had chosen to run, and just thinking of this in terms of, this is a serious game, and in real life, if I was running for my life and I made it in at the last second and I close it over, and these guys are, they want to kill me, they're banging on the door and they go, we can't get over that thing. Well, first off, they could just hop up on someone's shoulder and get over and kill me, or they could go through the bush. And I don't want to get hung up on the bush, but it's a bush. Not a tree, not a mighty oak tree or a great redwood. It's a bush, a shrub. That's enough about the bushes, because I don't want to keep going on about the bushes. Bushes. But, all that said, I think it was a pretty fun game. I think there's definitely moments that were really good, like when you kind of first play as Abby and you're running through the snow. There's this really great moment where it's I don't know, you kind of come into an area and you see there's a few kind of infected around. You're like, okay, I might be able to get one, oh maybe two. You look at your gun, you go, oh, gee, I've only got like 3 bullets. This isn't great. I'm gonna have to do stealthy. And then the more you look, you're like, there's loads of them. There's no way. So I just went, I'm gonna run. I'm gonna run. As soon as you start running, 20 of them come out. Then 50 of them come out. Every corner you turn, there's like 20, 30 more. There's hundreds like following you. And it was crazy. And it was very natural. Um, the flow of it was very natural, which was really good. Because it didn't feel like, oh, you have to, this is the part where you're going to start running now. I just felt like I started running, and then I was like, I really made the right choice here. Um, so that was really cool. And then you're like crawling through this fence, and it's like a wire fence, but the infected are on the other side, so they're reaching through. But the more of them there is, it's weighing down on the fence and it's pushing over, so your gap is getting smaller and smaller. Um, so there's all stuff like that. It's very good, and I will say it's very immersive. Um, One thing I really liked about it was a couple of times in the game, and I probably would have liked to see this a bit more, but when you're going through like a crawl space under a house or an event, there's a couple of times where there were infected in there with you, which is something I've always wanted to see in a game ever since I played Batman Arkham Asylum, and you spend so much time going through vents. Um, and back then, when I was like playing it when it came out, I was probably like, I was probably like 10 or 12 or something. But when that like first came out, I seen it because my older cousin was playing it, And I was like, "Oh, this is the best game ever." And he was like, "Yeah, yeah, it's really cool." And then I was like, "Oh, I'm going through the vents. This is great." And he goes, "Yeah, yeah. But remember we saw Killer Croc earlier?" And I was like, "Yeah." He goes, "He's in the vents." I was like, "What?" And he was like, "He's in the vents somewhere, at some point in the game." And he's like, "I can't remember when it is, but just at some point in the game, he's crawling around the vents, and that's when you run into him." I was so afraid the entire game because it's so small and your view is so like pointed. And then I'm like, what if he comes behind me? What if he comes in front of me? I don't know which is worse. Um, and he didn't. He like that doesn't happen. So he just lied because I guess he thought it was funny. And it is looking back, but it also gave me you know, it gave me this idea that this was going to happen, and then when it didn't, I was kind of like, oh, that would have been really cool. And there's a few games where things like that, where you have to crawl through these little spaces, and I'd always thought it would be really cool if they had, something scary waiting there. And then I think it's like when, like near the start, when you're first kind of playing as Abby, you're crawling under a house, and I just kind of had that thought because I always have this thought of, what if there was, a zombie in here? That would be pretty cool. And then there was, and I was very happy. But I also crapped myself, so that was pretty good. So I will say, the gameplay was pretty fun, and both games are good at being what they are. Red Dead is like like rootin' tootin' kind of shooting cowboy game. You're on horseback and you're jumping off things and you're shooting. It's great at being that. Um, Last of Us is much slower paced. It's kind of creeping around and looking for supplies, and it's very good at doing that.
And it's good at being scary.
Especially, things like when you find the big boss underneath the hospital, this big creature. There's a couple of kind of like boss fights that are quite scary but quite good, and quite challenging. So yeah, both games very fun to play, I will say. However, now we get to the stories, and this is where I feel um, we can make it's fairer to make the comparisons because that was gameplay. They're two different kind of games, so you can't really compare them in any kind of way that you can view one or the other in a negative light because they're two different. It's apples and oranges. But the story, this is my thing. This is where I found the problem. So we briefly touched on the story of Red Dead Redemption and Red Dead Redemption 2. Going into a bit more detail, when we look at the timeline, it's a prequel, which is interesting. It's a sequel that's a prequel, a sequel prequel. And we see the start of the game. We start off as Arthur, and we see him as he is. We kind of see the status quo. Arthur is an immoral person, although he kind of has his own code when it comes to certain things, but he does do bad things for bad reasons. Um, but the game gives you options kind of early on, to kill people or spare people, and that's kind of up to you. But beat by beat, beat for beat, going through the story, you're robbing banks, you're killing people, you're doing things that good people don't do. So we see these things, we see these immoral actions, but we see their consequences as well, because that is the crux of the story. When debt collecting for the gang, and he's being quite rough, and it's one of those missions where you can have fun and you're like, oh, I'm robbing a bank and I shot the bank man in the face, but it's all cool, I'm having fun. These debt collecting missions are very hard to justify because it's just there's something that's just so kind of real because they're not really fun. Like there's no kind of rooting and tooting and shooting. You're just going into someone's house and kind of beating them up until they give you money. Um, and I think that's by design, is that they're not fun, and you kind of say, oh, he is a bad guy, and you go to one guy's house and he's this nice guy. I think he's helping collect for charity or whatever. He's a pretty nice guy. He owes some money, so you start beating him up. You beat him to death, pretty much. But as you're beating him, he coughs up blood on you, blood infected with tuberculosis, which then infects Arthur. From that point on, because of his action, he's been set down a path um, where there's only one end to this path. He's going to die, which is very Shakespearean, I think. Suck my own dick. Very Shakespearean. But it's interesting. So from that point, and I always hate when I'm replaying, I always put off doing that mission for as long as possible. I don't know, I guess just hoping maybe something will happen where I don't have to do it and then Arthur can just live a happy life. But you do the mission, you get TB, and from that point on, the story is about Arthur seeking redemption. He's trying to undo all his past evils and save kind of as many people and save himself by saving John Marston and his wife and child, his family. So I think there's similar themes to this Red Dead Redemption 2 and The Last of Us in that the past will always catch up with you, and that's what happened to Arthur. There was consequences to your actions. So because of his immoral actions and because of him beating up that man, he got TB, and that's what killed him. If he didn't do that, if he was a good person, if he had let him go, then that wouldn't have happened, and he could have lived for who knows how long. Same with Joel. The reason he is killed at the start of The Last of Us 2 is because of his actions at the end of 1. It's taken a bit longer. It's taken 4 years, but the past has caught up with him. And then Ellie goes after Abby, and Abby loses all her friends. That is because of her actions that have now caught up with her, and vice versa. And you see, so it's a similar theme. So going back to the story of Red Dead Redemption 2, we see the gang at the height of its power, which really makes for some excellent kind of gameplay and story moments. An example of that is when the gang is going after John's son Jack, and they go to the Braithwaite Manor, and there's just that one moment where they're all walking down the big long tree tunnel, and they're all kind of in a line, and I don't know, there's just something so cool, so visually appealing about that moment, and the way it's set up, because you are a gang of immoral people, but this is a good action in a way. These are bad people to a certain extent, and they've done a bad thing. You're trying to save a child, so there's just something so satisfying about that moment. So you see the gang at kind of their height of the power, which is fun to play as, but then you see their eventual decline. This is accompanied as well throughout the story by Dutch's failing mental state. You kind of see this. It's a very slow burn of Dutch at the start, and I remember playing it first and being like, how is this character going to end up, how's he going to end up as a bad guy, and how is he going to end up as the character we know from Red Dead Redemption 1? And it's actually pretty interesting how the story plays out like this, because you start off as a gang and you kind of have these antagonists with your rival gangs and stuff like this, and you kind of have you don't really know where the story is going. You have a rough idea, but then as it goes on, Dutch, who is your kind of closest companion, becomes the antagonist. He's the one, like Dutch and Micah, but Dutch is the one who's kind of ruining it for everyone, because he's constantly saying he has these plans that don't go anywhere, and you kind of see slowly but surely that he's not all he seems to be. It's quite interesting that you start off the game with an ally, but he becomes the antagonist. And I mean, it should be obvious because you know what's coming, and that's kind of an interesting thing as well. Although this is a prequel, and you know what's going to happen, you still kind of don't believe it just because of how these characters are presented and how slow of a burn it is. And you have other characters that you don't know, like Micah is in it, and you obviously he's treated as a very big antagonist as well. So you could kind of go, oh, maybe the focus is going to be on him and something happened with Dutch later, and you don't really think about it. But then when you see these little moments, like Dutch in the cave when he strangles the old woman, and Arthur's kind of starting to have enough of his crap, and he's like, are you going to strangle me as well, Dutch? It's really great story beats like that. And then Dutch is kind of almost the physical embodiment of the gang. So the more people that are killed, the kind of crazier Dutch seems to get. And then when Hosea dies at the bank robbery, that's kind of that's like the last straw. And after that, it's just going downhill completely. Dutch is meeting up with these new people, and it used to be that to be in the gang, people that they knew for years, you trust them with their life. Then there's these other people that Micah kind of knows, and you don't really know, and it's just become this whole different thing. And then Arthur, who was Dutch's right hand man, in the wake of this, moves away, and you can see he's starting to kind of become close with other characters like John Marston, who at the start he didn't really get along with. Rain Falls, the Indian chief, Sadie, who again kind of started off one way and then ended up quite important towards the end, and Charles. And it is kind of an interesting thing that kind of where every character starts at the start of the game kind of ends up at the opposite. He doesn't know Sadie, but she's when they do find her, she's a widow, and she just seems like she's going to be some distraught woman who you don't really hear from again. Um, he hates John. He's kind of indifferent to Charles, and by the end of it, these are his main people who are kind of willing to risk for each other, and he risks and gives his life to save John. So I will say this is not going to be completely unbiased because I do have my own opinions. So I will be kind of talking about things I didn't like about Last of Us 2, and maybe not so many things I didn't like about Red Dead 2. But that's because I really like that game, and as I said, this isn't an unbiased comparison. This is kind of a review of Last of Us, using Red Dead 2 as a kind of a sparring partner, I guess, to compare it, because there are some similarities. So, story of Last of Us 2. It's a sequel, not a sequel prequel. It's just a sequel, but it has a non-linear timeline, unlike Red Dead Redemption 2. And I think for me, this is the biggest problem, is that the story is chopped up and moved around in places where I don't like. It makes sense in terms of where the character was at that particular time. That's why they remembered that memory, which is, part of the story, blah, blah, blah. But in terms of when the writers were writing this story, I don't know why they put it together like this. You're making a puzzle. I don't know why they did this. It's interesting doing a non-linear timeline. One of the most popular examples of that would be like a film like Pulp Fiction, where you see events kind of happen at different times and bounce around, and that's kind of cool. And it can work, and it can be interesting, and it can lend different qualities to a story that it wouldn't have if it just played out as usual. However, however, my problem with this is I think they kind of, I don't think it was utilized very well, and I think they kind of used it to have their cake. They wanted their cake, and they wanted to eat their cake and have it too. So I'm gonna give you the story. I'm gonna give you a rundown of the story, but I'm gonna tell you it as it happened. And I think that's the problem, is when you start thinking about the story as it actually happened, as opposed to the way it's presented to you. I just wasn't happy with it. It just didn't do it for me. So we start off and we see Joel and Ellie 4 years after the events of the first game, and their relationship is troubled. We don't know this yet, when we start playing, but Joel or Ellie has figured out what happened. She figured out what Joel did at the end of the first game, and she cannot forgive him. This is told through flashbacks that happen later on in the game. But as it happens, at this point, she knows, and she's having trouble forgiving him. There's a party where this girl kisses Ellie I didn't know this because I guess there was some. I think there was some DLC to the first game where you find out Ellie is a lesbian or something. Um, so I was a bit surprised. But she's some girl kisses Ellie, and then some guy has a problem with it. So Joel steps in, kind of being overprotective. Ellie is then more mad at Joel because of that, because he was being overprotective, blah blah blah. Um, and she's like, I can look after myself. I can do all this. Then she goes to see Joel. He's sitting on the porch and he's playing his guitar. That's a big point, the guitar, because he teaches Ellie how to play guitar, and that's kind of that's how they connect. Um, so he goes up and he's playing guitar on the porch, and she's like, I can take care of myself. You can't keep standing up for me. I could have controlled it and blah blah blah, and they're doing all this, but then Ellie starts like, she's like, you're such an asshole. Why didn't you let me die? Like, why did you save my life? And she says something, and I want you to remember this. She says, "What if you?" She says, "Why didn't you let me die? If I had have died in that operation, my life could have meant something." Now, what does that tell you? When you hear that, what does that tell you? It tells us where Ellie is at the moment. So that she is feeling a lot of guilt. I guess survivor's guilt, where her life is now being given this immense kind of importance and value because of the consequences that would have happened if she had died. If she had died, she could have saved millions, potentially billions of people, but she didn't. She's alive, and now the weight of that is on her, and she feels like, how can she give her life more meaning than saving everyone, essentially? She could have saved everyone in death, but now she's alive. How can she do that or better? And she can't. So she has these feelings of guilt, but also she's kind of directing them at Joel, because she's angry about what he did, as well. So they have this little moment where she says this, that she can never forgive him, um, which she said when she first found out as well. She said, me and you were over Joel, but evidently she got over it because we never see a particular point where they kind of resolved it, but we just know that they kind of became friends again. Um, so she tells him this. She tells him this on the porch. She says, I can never forgive you for what you did, but, but, I'd like to try." And then a teary-eyed Joel, um, he says, "Okay." He says, "I like that." And it's this lovely moment, and it's one of my favorite parts from the game. Um, and to be honest, this is what annoys me because this happens in terms of when it actually happened in time. This happens at the very start of the game, but this is probably the last scene or the second last scene you see before the game is over. And this is why I feel like this kind of shifting time or this non-linear timeline didn't work, because when you see that, it seems pretty clear that almost seems like a direction for things to come by themselves. That you think, okay, the game is going to focus on Joel and Ellie coming together to try and reconcile their differences. Although she feels anger towards him and guilt to herself that she's directing towards him. So there's these issues that they're going to have to get over, but also the issue that she feels that she's going to have to try and give her life meaning. And that seems like the goal, or that seems like an obvious goal for the next installment is Joel has saved her life. Now, what is she going to do with it? What is it? And they say it. The writer said it because Ellie said it. She said, "Why didn't you let me die? My life would have had meaning." So that's something that's clearly important to her. So she says this. So you think, okay, this is what the game is going to be about. This is a good direction. Then, the next day, Joel is killed. Yep, he is. He has his brains beaten in with a golf club by Abby. Now, as I said, talking about themes, the past always catches up because of what Joel did. Yes, the ending was was very bittersweet in the first one. Joel saves Ellie. It's completely understandable why he does it, although it might not be the right thing. It's one of those, is it the right thing, but it's the wrong thing. It's very interesting. It gives you something to think about. Food for thought, as they say. As they say. So, Joel's past catches up with him. This girl wants revenge because Joel, in the escape with Abby, killed her father. And, that's pretty understandable as well. She wants revenge for that. It's taken her 4 years to get it, so she's held this grudge for a very long time. So Joel is dead. He's killed pretty early on, and people aren't happy about that. And I think that's one of the reasons why people have such a problem with this game. And I don't think it was necessarily a good decision either, in terms of, that was what made the first game, was that dynamic between Joel and Ellie. The story, or should I say, the world that the story is in, is it's kind of immaterial. It's a zombie thing. There's hundreds, thousands of zombie films, and they're all the same. There's a zombie outbreak, the world goes crazy, and then it's like Mad Max, post-apocalypse, trying to fight your way through. Nobody cares. You can go and watch The Walking Dead. You can watch. Okay, that's not fair. Some people care, but you can go to any other zombie thing and see the world kind of taking place. So they kind of got rid of what they had going for them, which was this relationship between Joel and Ellie, one that made sense. And to compare it to the first game, I think I like traditional storytelling. So as I said, this is non-linear. But in the first game, it's set up. We are here. We need to get there. It's point A to point B. That is the goal. That is, no matter where we are, and you kind of come into these different zones in the game where you have a kind of mini goal where it's like, we're at the bottom of the building, but we need to get to the top. But you never forget that you're aiming to get to the end of the line. That's where you're going. And the whole time it's told through this dynamic of Joel, who has lost his daughter, Ellie, who is alone in the world, who sees Joel as a father figure, and it works and makes sense. Everyone's motivations are clear and understandable. They make sense, and you get it, and you kind of think, I'd do the same in that situation. In Last of Us 2, Joel is dead, and you play as Abby, and you do interact with other people, but you do spend, I feel, a lot of the game alone. Now, again, I was talking to my friend, and he said that a part of that is because that is the world without Joel. It's lonely and isolated, and that's how it feels. And that makes sense. But just because something makes sense doesn't mean it's the best course of action. And what I mean by that is, yes, it makes perfect sense that if you had someone like Joel who was pretty much like a father figure and you lost them, you would feel so empty and so hollow inside, and your world would be so dark and so isolated, and it would just be horrible all the time. So it makes sense that that's how you play the game. However, I don't want to do that. That's terrible. I'm playing a game for entertainment. As I said with Red Dead earlier, it's a form of entertainment. You tell great stories, but it's escapism from real life, which is horrible and sad. So why would I play a game that's horrible and sad all the time? And both Red Dead and Last of Us, first game, second game, they have moments of kind of sadness where obviously John dies, and John Marston dies, Arthur Morgan dies, as many of his friends. And the first Last of Us, you lose people, and there are grey areas. So I'm not saying it has to be a happy ending, but there are moments of levity, and it can't all be dark all the time. You need little light moments, funny things. I think some of the best parts of The Last of Us 2 was when you were Abby going around with Lev, because you had that dynamic of this horrible world, and this person who is completely, you know, bitter to it all, and they've seen it all, they've had the experience, and they're just kind of going through. They're just living to fight another day. But then they have this kind of little innocent person, and although they're hardened, they're killing with you, they still have this kind of innocent view on everything, and it just lightens it up. And that's what the first Last of Us game had. The second one doesn't, except for those portions with Lev, because you're just an older Ellie who is just, she's bitter now, but she has no one to lighten it up. So, Ellie then sets off on a mission of revenge to go after Abby, the woman who came and killed Joel. Makes sense. And it's a pretty clear and understandable goal for Ellie. However, as the game goes on, I think partly due to the non-linear time, not only is it non-linear, but you also swap characters. You play part of the game as Ellie and part as Abby. So you play as Ellie, and you go to Seattle, where you I can't remember how you found out that this is where she's from, and you kind of spend, I think it's like a week or something, kind of sneaking through the whole town, um, killing people, and working your way through all the people who had a part in Joel's death, all of Abby's friends, trying to find her though, because she was the main one, who killed, extra killed him. So you're trying to find her, and it makes sense. You're like, I'm going for the revenge, and you still feel the pain, because you're playing from Ellie's point of view, and you still feel that kind of loss, and you feel her anger as well. But then, as you're there, you get to a point, and along the way, you meet Tommy, Joel's brother, Jesse, one of your friends, and Dina, who was the girl that kissed you, who you kind of are romantically interested in. You find out she's pregnant with Jesse's baby, so you kind of leave her by the wayside, and these people kind of come and help you, for like a mission or two. But as I said, you're spending a lot of time alone mostly. Then it reaches the point where you've found everyone except Abby, and the one place you went to where you thought Abby was going to be, she wasn't, and you're kind of like, oh, what's going to happen now? Boom, Abby's there, and she kills Jesse, the father of Dina's unborn baby, and um, already that's too much, of a loss. If you're going on a revenge mission to avenge the death of someone, you want to come back with more people, unless you're going by yourself, and it's like I've got nothing to lose kind of thing. If you lose one, another person, it kind of makes it redundant, I think. Um, but I think that's part of the point. Well, I thought that was part of the point, was because if you go looking for revenge, you're going to lose more ultimately than you'll ever gain. And I thought that was going to be a theme of the thing. Is obviously, yes, it's understandable that Ellie wants revenge, but as I said, as you go on and you lose Jesse, and you're starting to lose this, and like Dina's pregnant, you kind of think, okay, it's time to call it quits, because there's nothing that you're going to gain. You only have things that you're going to lose. But anyway, you get to this point. Abby's there. She kills Jesse. You see her shoot Tommy in the head, presumed dead. And then, boom, cut to, you're now playing the story from Abby's point of view, which is interesting. I think that's a bold move, and I think that's another thing people have a problem with, because I wasn't a huge fan, because I was like, okay, I'm playing as the antagonist now, who killed Joel, and I don't really like that. And like, you're doing missions where you have to survive, and you're like, I don't want her to survive. I want her to be dead. So I think that actually kind of breaks the immersion. And I know I said earlier that the game is immersive, and it is in terms of gameplay. You do feel like you get scared, and you kind of get into it, but this kind of breaks it for me. Is where it just felt like a bit of a slog at the start, not so much at the end. You kind of get used to it, and you get caught up in her story. But definitely at the start, it was very hard, and I was like, I don't want to play this. And maybe that sounds like I'm being a big baby, but it's not that I was like, oh, I don't want to play this anymore. It's just that you're just playing a lot, and then you go, oh, now I'm her. And like I said, the first Last of Us, you have a clear goal, point A to point B. This is, you were on a revenge mission, you're getting closer and closer and closer, and then we're back a week in time. You go back and you live the week from her perspective, and you're like, well, okay, what's okay? A different goal, a different character, and it's just something about it. It's just a sudden shift, and as I said, that's what they're going for. It's it's something different, um, but it's very jarring, and I think that is another thing that kind of is to their detriment. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I think that's something that put a lot of people off because it did make it a bit hard to want to play it then. Um, it wasn't something I was like, well, I can't go back. I can't wait to go back and play as her now. Because I didn't. I did want to play as her at the start, but as I said, it gets easier as you go on. So then you're playing as her, and you see the week from her perspective, and wouldn't you know, oh, Joel and Ellie are bad from other people's perspectives. Did you know that actually, Ellie, every time you kill someone as Ellie, that person is a person too? So you see the whole thing from her perspective, and it's like, oh, you know, like that. Ellie's killing all your friends, but they're your friends now, and Ellie's the bad guy. And I guess unlike Red Dead Redemption 2, where the shifting characters just happen so naturally, and it's such a slow burn, and you're always seeing it from the perspective of Arthur Morgan. This is you shift characters, so you're forced to see it from a different perspective. It doesn't the characters don't change, just how you're viewing them. But it's so jarring that you know I don't know. I think it just lacks a bit of subtlety. Because as I said, yeah, I think that could be an interesting point to explore. That from the different point of view. Yes, obviously Joel was the bad guy to her because Joel killed her father, and Ellie killed her friends. So obviously it's understandable why she did what she did. But when you've just spent the whole first game as Joel and Ellie, and then the start of this game, um, kind of as them, and seeing that feeling and that perspective carries over, and to suddenly shift, it's so jarring that you're like, okay, yeah, well, obviously, yeah, like that's why she did it, but like I don't care, because I'm still mad. I'm still mad about Joel being killed, and I want to play as Ellie. That's how you feel. So you're playing as Abby. You meet up with this kid. There's two factions: the Wolves, that's Abby, and the Scars, which are these weird cultists. You meet up with two kids that end up saving your life, and then you kind of stick together and you have this little pack. And as I said, that's probably my favorite part about it because it had that great dynamic of the older, bitter, experienced person leading and protecting this younger, kind of more innocent character through this horrible world. But even though it's so horrible, this innocent kind of character brings a bit of life to it because of the way they see things and just those things and those little moments of banter. And that's what I liked about the first game, and that's why I like that in the second one. And I think that's why it was kind of lacking. So meets this kid. It's a boy, but it's kind of hinted at that it was, or well, I think it's not overly explained. Like in terms of like scene to scene, the writing is pretty good. So this is a boy who was, it was a girl, but she shaved her head and she's kind of like, no, I want to be a boy, and blah blah blah. So it's grand to have this relationship. Maybe not like a father or like a mother and son, more like like an older sister and a younger brother kind of thing. But it's still the older experienced and the younger innocent, and the relationship parallels Joel and Ellie's, as I said in the first game. Then, you catch up with the present again as Abby after you kind of go on a few adventures with this little kid Lev. You catch up with the present. You're there with Ellie, and you have a bit of a fight, and you end up sparing Ellie's life. You're still playing as Abby from her perspective. You spare Abby's life or you spare Ellie's life. I don't know. Maybe this was purposeful that they had similar names, Abby and Ellie. But as Abby, you spare Ellie's life, kind of because of Lev, I guess, because you're about to. Ellie's down for the count, And then Dina comes in, so you're about to kill Dina, and Ellie's like, no, no, don't, she's pregnant. Which, Abby's kind of like, well, I don't care because Ellie killed Abby's pregnant friend earlier, but she didn't know she was pregnant. Um, so Abby goes, good. She's about to pull the knife across her throat. Lev says, no, Abby, don't do that. And Abby kind of has this moment where she's like, okay, okay, and doesn't do it. She spares her, and it makes sense, because the character of Abby, her story is being presented that she's kind of this asshole person and kind of remorseless, and she ruins everyone's lives around her. But this kid Lev seems to be, you know, making her a better person. So it makes sense for her at this point and her kind of character arc. So that's all well and good. Cut to we're on a farm. A number, I guess it has to be like at least like a year later because the baby's born and it's a big baby. Um, Jesse's dead. As I said, the father of the baby's dead, so it's Ellie and Dina living in this farmhouse with the baby, raising it as their own. And Ellie seems happy. They seem like they have a nice little life, but she is still haunted by the past and what has happened to Joel. She just can't get over it. She still has these kind of like panic attacks and episodes and all this kind of stuff. That's grand. Tommy shows up and he says he found a lead on where Abby might be. And you're like, oh, Tommy's alive, but he's all messed up. He's got like his face is all terrible looking because he got shot through it, and he's got walking with a limp because he got shot in his leg. And he tells you that his wife, him and his wife, are like taking a break and stuff. So it's all terrible. It's all really sad, and horrible. And then Ellie's kind of like, I'm not going to go after her. We lost too much. And I'm thinking, yes, that makes sense. Because, as I said, this whole idea of revenge, she lost Joel, that's terrible. But in doing so, she lost her friend Jesse. She nearly lost Tommy. Tommy, who also went for revenge, lost, he's crippled, lost his wife. So, they've already lost a lot of things. So to go after her again for revenge, which isn't ultimately going to do anything other than satisfy their own, I don't know, pride, ego. There's a lot of emotions. And I will say that, obviously, it's understandable that there's a lot of emotions. Ellie feels guilt because she just had a fight with Joel before, kind of a day or two before he died. She said that she could never forgive him. And then he died and she couldn't. So she obviously feels this kind of guilt. So after a kind of couple of days, she decides she's going to go after Abby again. So she takes off. Dina is with the baby. She's kind of begging her to stay. She's saying, please don't go. I'm kind of saying, I guess what I'm saying, like, it's not going to be worth it. You're not going to get anything out of it. You've already lost too much. Ellie's like, nah. And she goes anyway. So then you go, you set off. You see Abby and Lev. They're trying to find the fireflies. Then they get attacked by a gang of dirty bikers and brought back to this compound. You play as Ellie. You're fighting your way through this town. It's all grand. You run into the dirty bikers, and the whole time, as I said, you're Abby. You're killing your way through dozens of people, NPCs, as well as kind of main like characters that had a part in Joel's death, and you're doing terrible things like you torture one woman to get information, you kill the pregnant woman, and her the baby's father and stuff. So terrible things. You get to the dirty, filthy bikers, and you figure out where Abby is. You kill them. You fight your way through. You get to the end. You get to Abby, and they're like, Abby tried to escape, so she's up on the sticks or the stakes. So you go at the back. I think it's called the pillars. So you go at the back, and it's just this like field full of like stakes, and everyone's just tied up to them and left to starve to death or whatever. You go and you find Abby. She's there. She's barely alive. You cut her down. You cut her loose, and even though you're like you wanted revenge, I didn't want her to go the second time, but even then I was like, don't what are you gonna do? Like, she's half dead, you can't just kill her. So you cut her down, you cut Lev down, you start walking away, You're on your last legs. You're hobbling away. Abby's hobbling. We're all, half dead. You get to the boats. Abby gets in one boat. Ellie gets in one boat. They're about to go away, and then he says no. She has another kind of. She remembers Joel. She remembered Joel dying, how he died, how violent and gruesome it was, and she just can't let it go. So she says, Abby, I can't let you leave. Abby gets down on her knees and she goes, I'm not gonna fight you. And this is interesting because it's good character development. I'll say the character of Abby was done much better than Ellie in this, in the sense that we see Abby, she starts off a certain way, she goes on a journey, ends up, kind of back where she was, but ultimately changed. It's the hero's journey. Um, so Abby says, I'm not going to fight you. Ellie takes a knife to Lev and goes, you are going to fight me, otherwise I'm going to kill this guy. And she goes, okay, fair enough. So they start fighting. And they start fighting and they're going back and forth and it's alright. For like the end of the game, I was kind of like, as I said, it's this thing where it feels like this is like the last thing. It's like in Red Dead 2 when you finally have that showdown where it's like John Marston versus either Arthur versus Micah, or when you're John and you versus Micah. You want that like payoff, and this has been building the whole time. But yes, it's interesting to have gray zones, but you do need to draw a line in the sand eventually, I think, and say this is who you are and this is who you're against. And they can be completely understandable. The antagonist can be completely understandable from where they're coming from, but they have to be the antagonist. At this point, there's so much going for either side that it's not just a case of, oh, it's a grey area. I can see where they're both coming from. It's, I don't know, like, who I'm, like, what am I supposed to be rooting for? I don't want either of these characters to fight each other. I think they would be both better off if they just got on their boats and left, because Abby's become a different person. She's grown, and Ellie's becoming obsessed with this idea of revenge, and she needs to let it go. So it's not really like this great payoff fight. It's just kind of like, okay, I guess we're doing this, you know, kind of, okay, I guess I expected this, but I didn't want it to happen. Start fighting, kicking each other around in the ocean. You get down, you start holding Abby down under the water because you're playing as Ellie. You're holding Abby under the water. She's starting to drown, and it's going on, and I'm thinking, oh, I get it now. I get it. The whole reason they set up that, Abby and Lev have this, relationship that's like Joel and Ellie is for this moment, because and the way the shot was lined up, it was like you could just see the edge of the boat that Lev was in, but you couldn't see him, and I was like, I bet it's gonna pan, and we're gonna see Lev on the boat begging for his life, or begging for Abby's life, the way Ellie was doing for Joel. And there's going to be that, like, because they even look like the same distance apart. So you could have that, like, and because he's all, decrepit, he's lying down the way Ellie was, like, being forced on the floor. So if they just had that moment of, like, no, please, like, just don't do it, like, get up, Abby. And then that's when Ellie would go, oh my God, I've realized what I've become. I've become obsessed with this idea of revenge and killing this woman, and I've become her. The whole thing, I thought she was this horrible, like, evil person, and now I am her, and that's what would stop her. But nope, Ellie just stops. She remembers Joel, and one thing that bugs me as well is she remembers Joel, and they show you a little snippet of Joel on his little porch playing the guitar, and you're like, oh, that's a nice memory. And I was like, oh, maybe it's like she's finally realizing that it won't bring Joel back, and she, like, Joel wouldn't want this. I don't think Joel would want her to do this, although she makes references to it, that she's like, Joel would do this in the place. If their places were reversed, if Ellie was killed, Joel will go looking for revenge. I think that's possible, but I think it's like that. It's like in real life. Obviously, you can't know what the person wants because they're dead, but you kind of have to go if they're somewhere looking down on you. Joel does not want you to go looking for revenge. So Ellie spares Abby. After all this, she decides to spare her, which may seem anticlimactic, but I think ultimately that's kind of what needed to happen. Um, could have happened sooner. Like I think this whole idea of revenge in my head, I don't think it's enough to carry the whole story because then what happens is, so she lets Abby go. They go their own way. During the scuffle, Abby bit Ellie's fingers, so she's missing her pinky and her ring finger on one of her hands. She gets home, and Dina's gone. Dina and the baby are gone. They've left. Um, they've taken everything with them except kind of Abby's stuff or Ellie's stuff. It's all in one room. So they go and Ellie's there and she finds the guitar. As I said, the guitar comes up the whole way through, and this kind of leads into a lot of cutscenes where Ellie will play the guitar and that will remind her of something that happened with Joel. The problem is she goes to play, but her fingers are missing, so she can't play anymore. So not only has she lost Joel, lost her friend Jesse, got Tommy crippled, who then lost his wife, lost her kind of lover and her girlfriend, and the baby that they were going to raise and the home and the life they had together. She's now lost her ability to play guitar. The one thing that Joel taught her that she still had, that was their connection, even though he was dead. That's what they had together. She lost that too. And then the game's over. And I was like, okay, so what was the point? Because what was the point that revenge is bad? That you're gonna lose more than you get. I know that. I got that like pretty early into the game because that's just obvious. That's like I don't know. It was one of those things where it's like okay, or maybe one of my friends said he's like I wasn't looking for a point. I think he was just kind of enjoying the story as it was coming, like beat by beat. But looking at from the bigger picture, and that's what I mean, because the way it's split up, this is why I don't like it. Because even if it happened all like that, I think it wouldn't be so bad. But it's so chopped up that you don't know what they're aiming for. Because, like I said, you can have grey areas, and you can have I don't know whether I agree or disagree with the protagonist or the antagonist. But if you don't draw a line in the sand, it just becomes muddled because it's like they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. Where Ellie doesn't get a character arc, she doesn't get a story really. I mean, everything about her, even the fact that she um, is immune to this virus, it doesn't really play a huge part in this at all. There's some bits where she falls down and she doesn't breathe, or she breathes the spores, but she doesn't get sick. But that doesn't like she could have just had a mask in those situations because she was by herself or whoever she was with died. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't affect the story. Whereas that was the whole point of this story. So Ellie doesn't really get a character arc or a good story. She's just on a vengeance mission, and she doesn't get vengeance. She doesn't get revenge in the end, but she just loses everything along the way and ruins other people's lives as well, killing the father of Dina's baby, crippling Tommy, and all this kind of stuff. And then I'll bring you back to what I said at the start, where they had this little scene where Ellie said, "My life would have had meaning if you let me die on that table." So the meaning that Ellie has given to her life, or the writers have given to Ellie's life at this stage, um, is that she's this horrible, like revenge crazed person who ruined everyone's life. That's what Joel's. I don't want to say sacrifice, but that's what Joel's actions resulted in. Joel did that, and I think that would have been a much more interesting game to see where that went and what she was going to do. Because then I was like, okay, maybe the rest of this game is going to be like, maybe Ellie's going to meet up with Abby like one last time and be like, I'm not here to fight. Your dad was the Firefly doctor. He was going to fix me. Bring me to the Fireflies. I want you to make the cure, even if it kills me. And then you're like, okay, yeah, she's finally given her life meaning and she got over it, and it's more complete. Whereas this is just they wanted their cake, and they wanted to eat their cake and have it too, because they wanted to build off the success of Joel and Ellie, but they wanted to do a different story. And I think that's why Abby gets so much more character development than Ellie does. They're like, oh yeah, Joel dies, and Ellie's sad and angry and guilty, blah blah blah, and it doesn't change. Abby has this kind of subtle change, and she has all these like character moments. As I said, Ellie and Joel, they don't get that much, or if they do, it's all chopped up. And I mean, this is what I mean. So you might say, okay, and maybe from the way I'm describing it, you might be thinking, okay, well then maybe Abby is just the protagonist, and yes, she killed Joel, but like you said, from her point of view, she was in the right. And Ellie, we're supposed to go, oh, Ellie's the antagonist. Well, but there's like this one scene where you remember back, and it's Joel brings Ellie to this museum for her birthday, and it was very reminiscent of like something that might happen in the first game, and like it was one of my favorite missions. There's no real action to it. You're just kind of walking around and you're just kind of interacting with each other, and it's just really nice and to see that how the characters interact, these well written characters. And then Ellie has this moment where Joel, he finds this like shuttle, and she puts on a space helmet, and she like kind of has this, it's like this really lovely moment of pure kind of joyful innocence and happiness and safeness with Joel. And they show you that, and you're like, when you see that, you go, this person is not bad. This is not the thing you give to even your gray area antagonist. This is what you show because you're building off the last game, and that's because we care about Joel and Ellie and their relationship, even though Joel is dead. And that's one thing that kind of goes against this game as well. Is because of the way it's told, half the characters are dead before you get to know them. So Joel dies near the start of the game, but you see a lot of cutscenes with him after that, and the whole time you're thinking, "Oh, this is great," except he dies, and this never gets resolved. And the biggest example of that is when he's on the porch. Ellie says, she says, "I can't forgive you, but I want to try," and he says, "I'd like that." That never gets resolved because Joel dies a couple of days later. Or even playing as Abby, you're getting to know her friends, and it's all like, oh yeah, we get to know the backstory and this guy, and you get to know like the dog that you have to kill as Ellie, or you had to kill as Ellie. But like that, you're like, I remember this dog because I stabbed him in the head. So I'm not gonna get emotionally attached. Like you're not gonna trick me into going, oh, this is so. Oh no, the dog died. Like I know he died because I killed him. You made me kill him. So you just kind of naturally, kind of unconsciously, you're not gonna get as involved as if you didn't know what was gonna happen. So I think a point of difference between these two games is the difference between redemption and revenge, because Red Dead 2, it's in the name, Red Dead Redemption 2. That is what you're looking for, and that is the goal, and it's pretty clear what you're looking for and what you're trying to do to get it, and everything you do is trying to further that goal, because once you are put on a path where you know you're going to die, everything you do is trying to try to redeem yourself. It makes sense, it's clear, it's understandable. However, with Ellie, as I said, her goal is to avenge Joel's death. And that's clear and it's understandable at the beginning, but as the game goes on and as you lose all these things, and then as you get the perspective of Abby, which they give you, it's not understandable anymore. Or at least, as a player, you kind of lose interest, or you lose your involvement in it, where you go, okay, I don't want her to get revenge. I don't think she should keep going for this, but you have to keep going. As I said, the timeline of Last of Us 2, I think really was the bit I didn't like, because jumping back and forth confuses what the overall goal is. because you're all going on this revenge trip, and then you're nearly there, and then it's a different story, and then you're going to this story, and then you're swapping back and then back, and you're by the time you get to the end of the game, you don't know when the end is coming because you don't know what you were going for. You don't know what the goal is. Um, you know, whereas contrast that to Red Dead, and obviously they have the epilogue. But if you're just talking about Red Dead 2 proper, you know it's going to end when Arthur Morgan dies because that is the end. That has been set up from the start that when he dies, he needs to find redemption before he dies because that is the end. This is, is Ellie gonna die? Maybe. Is Abby gonna die? Maybe. Is she gonna get revenge? Maybe. That's what she wants, but I don't want her to get that. I don't really agree with her goal anymore. If you understand, if you get what I'm saying. And yeah, as I said, like they wanted their cake and they wanted to eat it too because they wanted the emotional payoff of this Ellie and Joel arc, and they wanted Joel's death, and they wanted to show another perspective that Joel and Ellie are the bad guys, and I think they just wanted like everything. They wanted to be, I guess the word I would use is they like Flanderized themselves, whereas they're like, oh, the first game, oh, that was so dark and moody, and you didn't know what was gonna happen, and it was so sad and serious. So they're like, this time around, get ready, because we're going to give you that times two. You like Joel? Joel's dead. How do you feel about that one? And I think they went for that moment. The story that we got was good. It was fine, but I think it just does a disservice to the story of the first game, and I think that's a bad sequel. A good sequel should take what was there from the first one and build on it. Um, Whereas this, I think it just takes it away from me. Like personally, obviously, um, you know, everyone has their own opinion or whatever. I could just be completely wrong. But the fact that Joel did this and that they set up in this game, but they do it kind of cheaply, where they show you this moment where Ellie says, like, that's what I mean. It's like they wanted to have a moment where Ellie says, Joel, I can't forgive you, but I'm going to try. And Joel's like, I like that. They wanted that emotion, but they wouldn't commit to doing a game about that. So they kill Joel, but then put that scene at the end. So you kind of forget. And that way, the last thing you see is that. So you don't get caught up in thinking about how it goes nowhere and it means nothing. I would say, coming to a conclusion, because I don't want to keep repeating myself. I'm going through my notes here, and I think some of the stuff that I have written down is I kind of touched on before. Just kind of I just ended up getting into it. So, in conclusion, we'll go straight to the conclusion. I think one of the reasons I didn't like The Last of Us 2 was mainly because it's just a bit of a downer, and I think this is true with films and with books and with games. These are mediums for telling stories, for entertainment, for pastimes, whatever you get out of them. But there has to be a certain understanding that no matter how good the story is or how realistic or gritty you want it to be, at the end of the day, like it's for someone's gonna have to watch it, and it can make it hard to watch it. So an example I would think of is, I seen the film Logan, in cinemas, and it's a great film, really amazing, kind of performances and the way it's written and the way it's shot and all this and great action. It's got something for everyone, but it's a very sad film because you're watching one of your favorite superheroes, Wolverine, while also having the knowledge of it's Hugh Jackman playing his last time as the role, and you see Professor X, who was the most powerful mutant ever, is now like an invalid who's losing his mind, and it's just sad, and it's physically hard to watch. And I haven't watched Logan since I seen it the first time in cinemas because there's no point where I sit down after a long day of work and I'm tired and I go, you know what, I'd actually love to feel really sad and down and upset right now. No, you want to be uplifted. And I'm not saying that it needs to be a happy ending. You could watch films that have kind of ambiguous endings or grey endings or sad endings, but they need moments of levity. It can't just be the same sadness all the way through because it just becomes a slog. It just becomes hard to get through. And like that, Red Dead Redemption 2 is equally as sad because that ends with Arthur Morgan's death. He gives up his life, and without kind of having a conclusion to his rivalry with Micah almost, and Dutch is betrayed in his last moments. But it's a bittersweet ending because he succeeded in getting John and his family out. Um, so there's sad moments in that, but it's interspersed with you have fun moments and silly moments and serious moments, and you get taken on a journey. But sadness is it's not a journey. You're just going down one road, and it just gets boring and old really quick. That being said, I think it is a good game. You know, probably you probably don't believe me after everything I said, or you don't believe I think it's a good game after everything I said. You think I'm just being nice, but it was good. Like it wasn't terrible. I guess I'm being as descriptive and as articulate about why I didn't like it. Because if someone just asked me about it, I wouldn't go on this mad rant. I'd just say, oh yeah, yeah, it was grand, but yeah, it probably wasn't as good as the first one. But if they were to ask and I said, well, what exactly is it that you didn't like? Then these are some of the reasons I would say. Yeah, so it was a good game. It wasn't bad. I did enjoy it, for the most part. There's some of the story elements I said I didn't like, but the gameplay was good. That kind of a game. I don't usually play kind of like scavenger games, but I really enjoyed it and it was scary and stuff. But I'm probably in no rush to play it again. Like I said, because it's a bit of a slog. Like the story, I experienced it once, and that was enough. I wouldn't go back just to relive the story in the same way that I do Red Dead Redemption because it's so subtle and it's so the way it's laid out is so like it's seeded. There's all these little seeds of things to come, and they kind of grow throughout the story. Whereas I just feel like Last of Us is lacking in that, and I think there's a bit too much pressure to follow up the first game, and they honed in on what they thought people enjoyed about it, and it was the wrong thing, or that wasn't the main thing. People maybe like the moody aspects and the sadness and the that them kind of the gray areas when it comes to characters and stuff. But just this whole revenge plot, I think it just became unsympathetic, and you don't have to like your main characters or your protagonists, but you have to understand them and you have to sympathize with them to a certain extent, in that you know where they're coming from and you understand why they're doing, and almost would feel you would do the same in their place. And one thing that I was thinking about as well, actually, while I was doing this, was how Red Dead Redemption 2 built off its predecessor backwards, because it's a prequel, which is kind of interesting. How it's a sequel prequel. It is a prequel, um, although it's so connected to the Red Dead Redemption. It just adds to it. Um, like really well. It just adds to it really well, and sets up like story details and fills in gaps that were there in the first game and goes into more detail. But I also think it's very clever that Rockstar did it as a prequel, because obviously there was a whole story there that was hinted at. So that's kind of there's just so much room for creativity there. You don't really have to come up with a new story from scratch, I guess, like The Last of Us did, where the first one was such a perfect kind of little tied up in a bow. There was no kind of loose ends, or if there were, I don't think any of them were big enough for a game. Whereas Red Dead Redemption kind of set up that there was this whole gang that John used to be with in this whole other life, so that makes sense that they would do this. But also, why it's clever is because they cannot undo anything you liked from the first game, from Red Dead Redemption. And like I said, because in the second game, because in The Last of Us, Joel saves Ellie for his own kind of reasons, because he's grown to love her. It's understandable, but it's not right. But is it moral? Blah blah blah. That's that's arguably the best bit. That's the bit that made the game, because the gameplay was grand, the world was grand, but it was the characters and that moment. That's the moment people remember, because they went, "Oh my god, like oh, it's crazy. I can't believe he did that, but that's what I would do." And but then to know that the direct result of that is that Joel is going to be beaten to death, and Abby is going to go on a revenge spree that gets all her or gets her friends killed. Did I say Abby again? I think I said Abby back there a second ago. That Ellie goes on a revenge spree and ends up getting some of her friends killed, losing everything she has. She loses everything that she had in life. She had everything to lose still, and she did. And that is the result of Joel's action. She never gave her life meaning. She never reconciled with Joel, and that's it. And I feel like that just takes away, like retroactively, from the first game, whereas Red Dead 2, it doesn't. It doesn't take anything away because it's beforehand, and I think that's kind of clever. So yeah, that was my little rant, I guess. Or you could call it a review, or I don't know what you'd refer to it as. But that was my thoughts on The Last of Us 2, comparing them to Red Dead Redemption 2, Red Dead Redemption 2, just because people have drawn a lot of comparisons between them. So I thought it'd be interesting to kind of give you my thoughts and go back. So if you enjoyed this, let me know. Consider subscribing for more videos. Maybe if people like this and this one does well, then I'll do more episodes like this, but there will be more regularly, format of my philosophy book episodes coming up in the not so distant future. So stick around for them as well. But yeah, thanks for listening.